Welcome to the Diversity Connector podcast, where we explore the rich tapestry of human experiences. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and together as we dive into conversations that bridge cultures, challenge stereotypes, and celebrate the unique perspectives each of us brings to the table. Each episode is a journey through stories and insights from a kaleidoscope of voices, each sharing their colorful narrative. Whether you're at home, on the go, or just anywhere in between, you're now part of a community that values understanding, inclusivity, and the beauty of diversity. So plug in your headphones, get comfortable, and let's connect through the power of our shared stories. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on the Diversity Connector podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our tribe. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your story with us today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. My name is Dr. Georgia Birch, and I'm based in Melbourne, Australia as well. So it's nice to have both of us in the land of Oz. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, and it started probably 20 years ago when my children were very small and they were in primary school, and my son came out one day and said, "I've made a new friend." And I said, "Oh, have you?" And he pointed in a direction, and I said, "Oh, is it that dark boy over there?" And he said, "No, Mum, it's not. It's the boy in the red jumper." And it was the same boy. And so there it started. And my journey started learning a lot about myself and my colonised, socialised views. I'd already done a science degree. I'd done a teaching degree, and I did a master's in women's health. I'd had some time off, and I returned after my family had grown up and gone to school. And I thought, oh, wow, what can I do? I can do a PhD, which I started, and I met a wonderful woman at my local community centre called Fatima. And she was in charge of the mental health group at our local high-rise commission flats. And those are for people who are newly arrived in our country or who require housing, emergency housing. And she introduced me to a group of African elders who happened to be from Somalia. And I thought, wow, this is an opportunity I can't miss. And so I did 5 years living and working there, which was not far from my house, which was perfect. And Fatima became my translator, my confidant. She was just so wonderful to me. And she's still one of my very best friends today, nearly 20 years on. And I looked at their health and wellbeing once they'd arrived in Australia, and as often been documented, those who arrive here are quite healthy, and then once they arrive, their health deteriorates. But in learning or in having those outcomes from that PhD, what I learned most, I think, was about myself and my whiteness and my privilege, and how that has tainted my privileged life for a very long time. And once I'd done that PhD, I'd had maybe a couple of months off, and I had kids finally in high school, and the local principal had called me and said, "Look, I've heard that you've done work with African communities. Would you be able to come and help us here at a high school?" The high school was in the western suburbs of Melbourne, which is predominantly the working class areas of Melbourne. versus the eastern parts, which is the more, I should say, privileged white areas. There are some schools that are further out on that fringe that would probably be in the same position, but predominantly the schools in the western suburbs are probably working class schools. So I went to the school and they were having a great deal of trouble with African Australian boys from years 7 to 12 in high school. They had extremely challenging behaviours, fighting in the yards, disruptive classrooms. And so when I sort of went there and found that these things were happening, they weren't graduating, they were dropping out, they were entering the justice system, I created a program, a mentoring program or a community liaison program where the school would actually employ young African Australian men. So we were looking at sort of mentors with between sort of 25 and 35 because they had to be someone who they could identify with and, you know, sort of not look like their father that's what they would say to me. So if I gave you an example, we have a person who's a rapper. He does that by night, and by day he's a community liaison officer. So what happened was within 12 months, we had every final year student graduate. We had no fights in the yard. We had a school captain who was African Australian, and we had really low levels of truancy, and the behaviours had improved. And when I wrote this report, I presented it to the Education Department of Victoria. So that's the main government office that runs all the schools in Victoria. And they were so impressed with the results that they gave funding to any school that had similar behaviours that were existing in their schools. At that time, we had a huge influx of immigrant families that were coming from war-torn Africa, and they were settling here. And so these community liaison officers would liaise with the homes and schools and just be an ear and a supporter and an advocate for all those students. And within probably the next 18 months, it was interwoven into 25 schools. So we had an amazing amount of young African Australian mentors, and they virtually just took off and ran with the program and made it their own. So I really had to just take a step back and go, well, you know, this is great. I made the program, but now it's time to step away. And I think with all my programs that I do or anything I'm involved in, I really try and be dispensable. It really shouldn't be about me. It should be just creating those opportunities for other communities to be present, and then they know themselves the best and they know the communities the best and they know what to do, which has since happened, which has been wonderful. And so once that finished, for me, not for them, I worked with a major hospital in Melbourne called Alfred Health, and they were looking at making a pilot hospital in regional Victoria, which is probably about 2 hours north of Melbourne, called a place called Shepparton. And we did consultation with diverse communities and our Indigenous population, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And we worked on that for about a year. And it was so desperate. The first time we had a consultation, we had 60 women arrive. And so I worked closely with that and was driving up and down from there, working with Indigenous elders. And it took roughly about 12 months. But the outcome has been that there are 4 new beds in that regional town so that people don't have to drive to Melbourne to receive care, which has been wonderful. But I suppose in all of that sort of messy life, I came to realise that, there is a lot of things that I need to work on. Being a white person, I think what seems to be recognised in a lot of things that I do is that why is a white woman being involved in, different diverse cultures, and how does that work? And I think that's a really, really good question for people to ask. I started working offering my services to a lot of organisations about diversity and speaking about how whiteness is involved in the racism that occurs in lots of different areas, and especially for young people in Australia here and who are African Australians. In Shepparton, there was a major school that had combined 3 lots of schools into one and called it a super school. And I've never seen more racist attitudes than I've seen there. I found those racist attitudes incredibly insulting, and a lot of white people didn't even recognise that they were being so racist. And I started to have to look at myself and say, this is something that we need to talk about. Whiteness is part of being racist. And as a colonised woman, I started to have to think that, I was part of this too. So I started to look at organisations who were looking at doing diversity across their staff. But when they started to hear about me talking about white people and what they do and how they are part of being a racist and racism in their organisation or their school or their life, they would quickly shut me down. So I was working with one woman who, she was a South Sudanese woman, I was an Australian woman, I was white, she was black. And when we were presenting, a lot of the people said, no, we would really like to hear from Mary and not from Georgia. So I quickly get shut down, and I'm often called a traitor when I talk about whiteness and how it virtually rules what things and how things are done. And often with people of colour, white supremacy is the norm. And, I had looked at my own life and thought, well, how many people of colour did I know growing up? Nobody. I was colonised as a white person. So it was just something that I like to talk about. And I once presented this at an African conference at Melbourne University, and I thought, well, I'm either going to be, really shut down here, or it's going to go off. And, of course, it went off. Everybody finally came up to me and said, oh, finally a white person has said something. White women's tears. We love multiculturalism, but we only love it when it's based around our narrative. And I find this a really interesting concept, that white people generally don't want to think themselves as a racist because they're nice people. I think I'm a nice person, so therefore I cannot be racist. But actually that's not the case. I get pointed out by my lovely friends who are of African Australian backgrounds. And look, just one example is, I've introduced somebody as, hi, this is my friend Mary, who's my South Sudanese friend Mary. And they finally came up to me and said, Georgia, I've never introduced you as my Australian friend Georgia. And, there's all these things that have socialised in me that contribute to that racism. And I found that incredibly visual at a school level. Students would be asked outrageous things, or people continually touching the girl's hair, or even the slightest thing. So those microaggressions that cause layer upon layer upon layer. It was unbelievable. And, you know, teachers were like, well, I'm not racist because I'm a nice person, or I don't do this because I came from, you know, I'm a migrant from the 1960s, or I have Aboriginal friends, so I can't be racist. So it's a way of looking at ourselves and looking at how multiculturalism works within the Australian community. We are a very multicultural community, especially here in Melbourne. I think we're probably the multicultural capital. So it's something that I want to explore further, and I'll be looking forward to doing that if there's questions.
What an interesting journey you've been on, Georgia. You know, listening to you speak, it's very refreshing to talk to somebody who's had time to just step back and self-reflect. So in your work, you emphasize the importance of giving a voice to marginalized communities. Could you share an example where your efforts in film or media directly impacted a community's access to health services?
So if we talk about maybe justice, which is where a lot of attention goes in Melbourne, and the media portray a lot of African gangs, if you like, here. And the media will put this on the front page of every newspaper that there is. And many of the students that I've spoken to have said, you know, we're just kids hanging around together. So if you have a group of white kids hanging around together, that's completely different to a group of black kids hanging around together. Because if you have a group of black kids hanging around together, they're deemed a gang. Even in a school situation, there was one school that did not allow more than 4 African Australian boys to be together in the schoolyard at lunchtime. Yes. Because the teachers felt threatened on yard duty.
It's interesting. I actually went to one of those schools up in Shepparton when I first arrived in Melbourne and talked to the kids there. And it was just shocking to hear that in 2022 that this is actually happening in Melbourne.
And, you know, in other parts of the world, sometimes you have like a large black community. But here in Melbourne, we're predominantly white. Even though we have a lot of multiculturalism, there might be Greek, Italian. So when we had a group of people come from Africa, it's a completely different story. There is a different look that we haven't been used to. And maybe in other parts of the world that have, you know, different people from different cultures, but we've only recently had this. If we've had Syrian refugees from Syria, which we've recently have, that's completely different, because when we're talking about young black men or young black women, they stand out because we don't have a lot of those people. So that in itself is difficult for young people because they already look different to everybody else.
They can't just blend in.
No, they can't blend in. And even though we have a lot of migrants, we don't have a lot of migrants of actual colour.
Yeah.
So they stand out. That's the first thing. And there's shops where they say, you know, no African people welcome. So it's
really sad.
And it's reinforced in our media a lot.
The media has done a lot of damage. So you talk about social logical barriers that prevent access to health services. What are some of these most significant barriers that you've identified, and how do you approach dismantling them?
It's I suppose when you've had your own journey and you've been to a hospital service, you've had to access something, it's difficult enough for a white person. It's difficult enough for me, who can read, can write English, to present themselves and get themselves understood.
Yes.
I can't imagine, you know, and you're not welcome as well. So even to when the person behind the desk is white and I can speak excellent English, I think that's a much more, you know, I feel welcome. because everybody looks like me, because I can speak the language. And, when it comes to whiteness, we're very individual people. We like individualism. I go to the hospital by myself. I don't need to have anybody else come with me. But if you're talking about a community that is communal, those people often come with 3, 4, 5 people, children that can't be looked after. And so the barriers are layers and layers and layers. And perhaps your English isn't as good. You have to wait until somebody gets home before they can take you because they're the only person who can speak English. The children have to be cared for. Large families. And so all of this prevents access to health services. All of this, when people don't arrive for parent-teacher interviews and the teachers go, well, why aren't they turning up? Well, there's a lot of reasons why they're not turning up. First of all, they don't feel welcome. And second of all, they've probably got 6, 7 children. They have to go to a lot of other things before they get to somebody's parent-teacher interview. So the accessibility, flexibility, language barriers, using their children as translators. I mean, all of this makes access very difficult.
Very, very difficult. So can you explain the role that well-respected community members play in your research and how you go about establishing and maintaining those critical relationships?
And I still have those relationships today. I think it's time. You have to spend time in that community. You have to understand what it's like. You can't just, I know the answer because I'm white and I live here. I think it's time. I think it's listening. I think it's understanding how things work, why things work. So if I give an example, one particular time, I used to arrange a meeting and every time everybody would be late, every time. And I used to think, this is so frustrating. This is, hello, white colonialised woman. This is so frustrating. Everybody comes late. It just drives me bananas. Anyway, towards probably at the end of, 5 years, I had to go and visit somebody. And on the way, I ran into all these people along the street. And of course, I know it's very rude if you don't stop and ask about their family and what they're doing. Anyway, I arrived very late at my meeting. And I thought, now I know why everybody is late, because it is rude if you meet somebody along the way, especially an elder, and you do not stop and talk to them and ask about their family. So, it's the small things that you have to understand.
Yeah.
And it's the small things that make the difference.
Yeah, it is.
It's living with these people. And when I mean living, I mean, being in their apartments.
Yes. So your podcast often features the voices of marginalized communities. How do you ensure that these individuals feel safe and empowered to share their stories on your platform?
That's a very good question. I just try and say, we want the story from your standpoint, not from my standpoint. I'm a white person. I have no idea what it's like to live in your shoes. And I let them run with the story. I let them, and it can be as diverse as anything. Like I can be talking to somebody and they can go completely off tangent on whatever the topic is. But I think that's obviously an important part of your life. It's an important part that we need to hear. And even though I might think it's, not relevant to my guidelines, if you like, it may be that I'm wrong and that they're right. And that's how I have to approach things.
So you're very, very open to all possibilities. So educating about racism, especially to those in denial, is a challenging endeavor. What strategies have you found to be most effective in these educational efforts?
Humour.
Mm-hmm.
White people do not like to be told that they're racist. I don't want to be told that I'm racist, even though I am, obviously. I can't not be, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah.
Because racism equates itself with something that's bad. When I think you have to equate racism with a sort of an introspection, a reflection of yourself. And you have to look at yourself as about how that actually contributes to it, which is what we do. I've been at tables where every person in the meeting, and we're talking about racism, and we're all white.
Mm-hmm.
How can that be? I can't be involved in a meeting that contains white people only. It's to me, it doesn't work. We don't know what it's like. We're not aware of what's going on. And all those people are interested in is keeping the status quo. We don't really want to rock the boat. We don't really want people to have a voice that will overtake our voices. We're happy for them to have a voice, and we want to hear from them because we're nice people, but we really don't want anything to change.
Yeah, and that was reflected very clearly with the referendum.
Very much so. And then people say to me, oh, that was not racist, but that actually was.
It was.
That's saying we respect you, we love you as sports people, we will have you open a ceremony, but we will not give you the voice that you actually wanted. We'll give you the voice that we are going to give you as a group of white people. We're going to give you the voice we choose, not the voice that you've asked us to give you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I was absolutely devastated with that. So how do you measure the impact of your anti-racism work? And what indicators do you look for to gauge progress, both personally and with your audience?
I think this is probably the hardest part for me to answer because I think I have very little impact on white people. I've been called a traitor. I get personal criticisms. I get abuse. And there is not many people who would like to hear about whiteness and how that contributes. I have done it with other African Australian young people that came with me. So I tried to balance it out. So it's not just like you.
Yeah.
And most of the people do not want to hear from me. They only want to hear, the success story of the African person who we saved by coming here to Australia. That's the only real narrative people want to hear. They don't actually want to hear, well, we're part of this too as racist white people. So I can't measure it because a lot of the time I'm talking to the converted, which is people who are of colour, who say, oh, my God, I can't believe you're actually saying these things. And it's refreshing and, oh, thank God somebody's finally said that. I also have those people of colour friends who definitely tell me when I'm being racist or, saying something that's inappropriate. And I encourage them to do that because how else do I learn?
Yeah, you have to be constantly learning.
Yeah, you have to be constantly learning, and it's a lifelong journey. Everybody says, oh, you're going on as if you've overcome racism. No. I would never say that. I don't think I could ever say that. I think it's a lifelong. I don't think it's ever going to be something that I can completely overcome, but I'm trying to unsocialise myself. But people don't want to hear that. White people don't want to hear that. And I find that that's hard, but I keep going. Yes. I will not stop.
You will get through to one or two. That will be a ripple effect on 3 or 4. Yes. So giving up is not an option.
No,
really.
It's not an option. And look, I value the connections I have with communities far more than white people liking me.
That's good to hear. Now tell me, if I could teleport you into the future, you're now 90 years old, you're sitting in your rocking chair, surrounded by your children, your grandchildren, and you are reflecting back on your life. If I could teleport you to go and meet the 90-year-old you right now, based on how you're living your life, what would you say to this wise woman who's leading you to that point?
I would say don't stop advocating, or I didn't want to stop advocating for those vulnerable, marginalised people. And no matter what the cost is to me personally, it's never going to be more than those communities already are involved in. Mm-hmm. And people say, oh, you're going to lose money, you don't get contracts, you don't do this. And I have been fine with that, and I hope I'm still fine with that at 90, that I can still have my coffee down at the local cafe with my Somali ladies and their children and grandchildren, and be happy to be with them and to ensure that they're happy, safe, and listened to.
Georgia, thank you so much for your work. You know, it is challenging. It feels like you're not getting anywhere. But I do believe that the next generation of young people who are coming up in the world need to hear what you're sharing. It's not our generation that will change in a heartbeat. One or two will, but I think it's the younger generation that we're really talking to so they can see the world in a different way. So please do not tire. Just keep on keeping on, knowing that we are behind you. We love the work that you're doing. And thanks again for doing this interview with me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is bringing us some very unusual people who really treasure and value what diversity is all about and the importance of us celebrating our differences and seeing the commonalities that we have, that we are more alike than we are different. It's really skin deep where these differences lie. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview yet another amazing person. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And bye for now. Thanks again, Georgia.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap, everybody, on today's episode of the Diversity Connector podcast. Thank you for tuning in and being part of our vibrant and global conversation. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a tapestry of diverse perspectives. Remember, every story you've heard today is a thread in the larger fabric of our shared humanity. So, as you step back into your world, carry these stories with you and let them inspire you to embrace and celebrate the rich diversity around us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these inspiring stories with more listeners. Do follow us on social media by looking for the Diversity Connector podcast for more updates. Until then, keep connecting, keep listening, and keep celebrating the beauty of diversity. This is the Diversity Connector podcast signing off. Stay curious, stay open, and